in general, enforcement is understood, right? And in the States, 94% of workers in the private sector don't have a union. And I'm thrilled by the uptick in unionization, but I think we have to remember that for 94% of private sector workers, they're solely dependent on public laws and public enforcement. So it really matters. And for vulnerable, I hate that term, but for BIPOC, immigrant, low-wage women, women of color in particular, foreign-born women of color, etc., this is like where it's at. And so I just want to sort of put that out there. I also want to say that I think what we all have in common is this belief that the idea of enforcement needs to shift from an intervention on behalf of an individual to agencies seeing their role as permanently raising job quality in these really difficult sectors. Not having this attitude, the poor will always be with us, but actually thinking more like unions, right? We're going to clean up this sector permanently. How do we do it, right? And so that's kind of that's the spirit, I guess, and the mentality that I think we all bring, to this moment, and that that this is a really hard problem because shifting the way an agency thinks about its mission, thinking about how bureaucracies operate is incredibly difficult. And so, okay, so that's the spirit of kind of what I'm going to share. So I'm going to talk about local enforcement also. And that kind of what's happened is that in the US, because it was kind of impossible to move federally, both in terms of strengthening enforcement, but also policy-wise, particularly around work-family policies and around protecting, finally calling in to these regimes coverage for domestic workers, for agricultural workers, for workers who had been historically carved out of the Fair Labor Standards Act because they were legacies of racial capitalism and chattel slavery in the South in particular, and deals that were cut between Southern elected officials, Southern members of Congress who were very powerful committee leaders in Congress historically. That's what we kind of ended up with. So at the local level in particular, there was an effort to create enforcement regimes and pass policies that would be family and worker friendly, so revolutionary in terms of gender, and also would cover domestic workers, home care workers, day laborers, and others who'd historically, been excluded from these laws, and independent contractors, right? Gig workers, etc. So with local enforcement, the first thing to say is that it was local policy that led to local enforcement. Does that make sense? That if this cluster of policies got passed, there needed to be a local agency that was going to enforce them because they didn't exist at the state or federal level, right? So there needed to be an enforcement regime. Am I making sense so far? Okay, so in particular, it was about higher minimum wage. It was about paid sick and safe time. It was about paid family leave. It was about fair scheduling and something called ban the box, which was really the first of these that really focused on saying that that employers could not ask people their incarceration history, right there, and so that was passed widely in many jurisdictions. And now there's a move to try to push just cause. So going from employment at will, which is a huge issue in our country. Okay, so and domestic worker bill of rights and these other things. So now local enforcement is in 26 cities across the country. The first one was in San Francisco. The next one was in Seattle. The other thing that's been novel about these agencies is that there's been much more of an opportunity to shift the way they do enforcement because they're not already like entrenched, right? So, in some ways, if you think about state enforcement, by states, I mean our 50 states in the US, and federal enforcement, that's sort of like Rip Van Winkle waking up after 200 years, right? Trying to change the way that the agencies operate. These are new, they're like newborn babies, right? So you hope that they won't just default to the way things have always been done, right? That's sort of the opportunity. So in particular, that's meant that in some places, there's been much more openness to sectoral strategies, right? So targeting particular sectors like we had talked about, right, with the DET, and co-enforcement. And that means formalized partnerships with civil society organizations, in particular worker centers, and to a lesser extent unions, and definitely with legal nonprofits that are in deep relationship with particular constituencies, and in particular actually funding these organizations, right? So cities actually putting money in. So for example, in Seattle, there's $3 million every 2 years that goes to funding a set of worker centers and legal nonprofits and ethnic chambers of commerce to do outreach to local BIPOC and immigrant small business. So that's been kind of a big, innovation. And I'll say more about kind of the limitations of these things, but right now I want to say the, kind of how the programs work. In the most exciting examples of this, very often, if you think about it this way, it's that workers have tacit knowledge of how employers are violating the law. How do you get that tacit information, that tacit knowledge, if the workers don't trust government? Maybe they don't trust government because they're undocumented. Maybe they don't trust government because they've had bad experiences, et cetera. And the biggest reason is they're afraid of retaliation. They don't want to lose their jobs, right? And retaliation is very, very real. Okay, so if you want the information workers have, then you have to work through the institutions workers trust. And that's where worker centers come into the picture, right? And so there are examples, pretty well-known examples, for example, in San Francisco, where investigators would go into a restaurant where they had heard there were high rates of violations and no workers would talk to them, or they'd tell them everything was savvy, right? Everything was fine. Then the worker center would spend 2 months building relationships with the workers, and they'd end up with 100 workers telling them, and millions of dollars in fines, and so it really matters who is talking to workers and who is getting them to come forward and that kind of thing. And so one of the coolest things that's happening in Minneapolis now is that the Office of Labor Standards basically tells an egregiously violating firm, well, you can either pay treble damages and be named and shamed publicly, or you can allow this worker center to go and do know your rights trainings in the workplace with workers in their language. And what the worker center does then is it gives out its information and has an option for organizing, right? Has access to the workplace. So at the local level, there's more of a recognition that a compliant sector is in everybody's interest. And so there's more opportunity to get them to engage in things that support organizing, not to say I'm an umpire, I'm a neutral, but actually to understand that an organized labor market is in everybody's interest, right? And so that's kind of the other thing. So and I'll just say in terms of successes, that some of these agencies are engaging in triage. If you understand that agencies have limited resources, and so they need to not treat every case the same way. So if it's a worker that's, on their way out the door and they haven't received their, their severance, that is not the same as a bunch of workers that are being, subjected to wage theft and are still at the workplace, right? Or, health and safety problems or whatever the case is. So, or if you've got very, very middle-class workers versus workers who are low wage, there's like lots of ways to do triage. If there's certain sectors that you think are really critical to focus on. So there's been success in getting these agencies to embrace some kind of triage. And the most important thing is that if you do that, you can free up resources that would be spent on complaints for sectoral targeting, right? For strategic enforcement. Does that make sense? Okay. So, all right. So non-trivial sums of money have been recovered for workers whose rights were violated. Obviously, there's been major policy wins, different types of laws for those who've been previously unprotected. And so one thing is just not thinking about these policies as just being the same as the feds, right? That, it's not just replicating, right? It's a whole new level of experimentation. There's money for worker organizing, right, through the grants that these organizations receive, and it facilitates entree for worker organizations into the workplace. That's the, and I'll just say it's kind of another layer closer to the ground, right? In terms of local, it's quicker, and it's another venue for enforcement. So yesterday, I guess there was discussion about fragmentation as a bad thing, but I'll just tell you that for organizations, they see it as a useful way to venue shop, right? They see it as a way to like think, oh, well, will I go to the local agency? For this particular case, local would be best. Or will I go to the state agency? For this other case, state would be best. Or will I go to the federal government, right? So one way to think about it is fragmentation. Another way to think about it is, a multiplication of possible opportunities. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about failures. First of all, we have preemption. We have a huge problem with preemption. The right wing is better organized, in my view, on this stuff than the left wing in the US. And it means that there always feels like they're 5 steps ahead in terms of thinking about this stuff. And so early on in this work, they started passing legislation in the states where they could to preempt local policy like this. And so unfortunately, where did they do it? They did it in the South that needs it the most. Why do they need it the most? Because Southern states have the fewest regulations. They default to the federal minimum wage, which is very low. And they have very little to no interest in enforcement or capacity. So, and also in the Midwest. So that's one piece of it. The other is that it's very hard to institutionalize strategic enforcement practices. Why? Well, sometimes the directors, so in our system of municipal governance, the city council is usually the one that pushes for these kinds of things. They pass the legislation, but then the mayor is the one who actually gets to appoint the person who runs the agency, the director of the agency. And often the mayors are very worried about the, kind of the perception of the business climate. And so what that means is that they tend to kind of chill out the agency, right? They want to limit what the agency does. So that's kind of a constant, problem. And so in particular, it comes up in the following ways. There's always a fight to do naming and shaming, right? So, as Kevin talked about, and we had talked about, it really matters, right, to publicize by name the egregious violator. I totally agree about not naming and shaming violators who, have particularly small businesses that, I'll talk about later, have other reasons for violating the law. Often mayors don't want to do that, right? Why don't they want to do that? Because they have ambitions either to run for re-election, or they want to run for governor, or they, and so they're fearful that that they'll be labeled as being anti-business. The other thing is that sometimes there's a tug of war inside the city government, right, where some agencies don't want to do it. And so that's one example. Another is carve-outs, right, where literally Hannah Shepard, who I'm really sad isn't here this morning, she and I did a paper on asymmetric power. And we tried to ask the question, why was small business so unsuccessful at preventing a lot of these policies from passing? And it's mostly, I mean, we made an argument that they were divided. That's why they were fragmented, they were splintered, and and these were in progressive cities. But mayors literally fought for carve-outs for their favorite restaurants and stuff like that. Like they figured out how things would work just to, yeah. So, and there was another huge debate about whether franchisees were actually small businesses or whether they were, big businesses. So, and that mattered because if you were a small business, you had more phase-in time, and in some cases you weren't covered by these laws at all, depending on the law, on these local policies. So that was a big bone of contention. And the International Franchise Association actually sued to try to stop franchisees being considered part of the, being considered big business. And they were unsuccessful. But yeah, so franchisees, that's been another piece. The other thing though, is that in some cases, these agencies, unfortunately, and you know, I'll say more about this on the panel, but if we don't give them another vision of how to enforce the law and how to think about governance, they default to backward enforcement regimes, right? So you've got these very progressive policies hitched to these backward enforcement regimes, right? That, you know, and so, and in particular in San Francisco, you know, Jake's been really involved in doing a bunch of these studies. We always start when we work with agencies by doing a study that shows them that the rates of violation in certain sectors are very high, but the rates of complaints coming from those sectors are very low. So you show them the evidence, and still they'll say to you, "Oh no, there's not a lot of violations." And you know, so the director, for example, in one city said to me, "Oh no, all the employers pay minimum wage because otherwise they wouldn't be able to have work, you know, to hire workers." And this is me handing him this study, right? That like literally went through sectors where the violation rates were off the charts, right? So, you know, that happens. The other issue is about salaries, right? Salaries are too low, and it means that people are constantly churning, not in all the agencies, but in some of the agencies, that is a huge problem. So for example, in Los Angeles, which should be the best local agency in the country because it is the mecca of worker organizing and immigrant worker organizing and worker centers and unions and them working together and all of that. The LA office is terrible. And in part, that's because they couldn't hire anyone from the outside who would bring new ideas in. It was entirely civil service. Oh, okay, sorry. And so that's a situation where workers are constantly looking for where they can jump to other agencies within the city so that they can get a higher salary. So I'll just say that the last thing is co-enforcement is really exciting and really important. The question is, can it drive structure back into the labor market? And what does that look like to do that, right? I'm out of time, but if you ask me in the Q&A, I'll say more about that.